12 common mistakes often made by new pilots with the DJI Mini 3 Pro and how you can avoid this kind of thing. Let's do this. So hello and welcome once again to the channel. Nobby Green here on this very fine day. 12 common mistakes often made by new pilots, intermediate pilots, or any pilot really. It's all about common sense using the DJI Mini 3 Pro. So on we go with the video, and tip number 1, check your firmware. Yeah, quite important. Check your firmware before you go out flying, especially on the DJI RC and the Mini 3 Pro, whichever drone you're using. Make sure that your firmware is up to date. The last thing you want to do is get out into the field and you get that firmware upgrade message and you've got no Wi-Fi, and it's going to take you a long time to update the firmware using your phone if you've got your phone with you. So always check your firmware, make sure it's fully up to date before you go out to fly. That's tip number 1. Tip number 2, make sure you charge your batteries. I know this sounds a bit teaching you to suck eggs, but make sure that your batteries are on charge before you go. You might have charged them 3 or 4 days ago and think, oh well, we should have enough flight time. But always go out with a full battery. Last thing you want to do is take off, start flying out, and then suddenly your battery depletes. Make sure you charge your batteries. Always do a pre-flight check, checking the props on your drone, checking the motors, and make sure that everything is how it should be before you fly. Last thing you want is a chip in a propeller and that goes twanging off into the distance somewhere. The last thing you want is for that drone to come crashing down because a propeller has shot off somewhere in the far distance. Tip number 4 is make sure that you've got enough satellites locked on your remote before you take off. My advice on that one is 12 to 15 satellites. Simple reason, if you start the drone and you've not got enough satellites locked, chances are if you take off with not enough satellites locked, the home point won't be updated, and that could cause you serious problems, especially if you lose signal. Where's it going to come back to? Not where you took off from. So make sure you've got enough satellites locked before you take off. Tip number 5, dusty areas. If you're taking off from sand or some gravel or something like that, it's always best to use a landing mat or a landing pad, or better still, learn to hand launch and hand catch. I hand launch and hand catch all my drones, especially the mini series drones. They're really easy to do. I even hand catch and hand launch the Mavic 3 Classic, quite a weighty drone. It's all about confidence, having the confidence to do it, and you'll find that if you take off in dusty areas, the liability is that you're going to get sand not only in the air vents but possibly into the camera lens itself. Which brings me on to tip number 6, using a UV filter. Now I use the UV filter on the Mini 3 Pro. As you can see, it's installed on there. What that does, it stops any dust actually getting onto the lens. If you don't use a UV filter, or you just use the standard lens cap that comes with the drone, what I advise you to do is get yourself one of these. It's a lens cleaning kit and it comes with 3 different attachments. You've got a lens wiping pad, and you've also got a brush that you can use to clean off any debris. I would normally do this every time you finish your flight, especially if you landed in a dusty area. But it's also good to periodically check your lenses for dust. The last thing you want is a speck of dust or a dead fly that's been crushed on your lens, and you go out the next day and you've got that on your footage, and your footage could be ruined. So that's tip number 6, is to use a UV filter where you can. Links to those will be down in the description if you're interested. Tip number 7, smooth footage. Now, new pilots often go out and fly and they get jerky movements, and that can ruin your video. It's all about practice. Using your spotlight mode is a good example of this, getting smooth footage. The last thing you want is any jerky movements which can ruin your footage. So make sure that you fly smoothly. There is EXP settings where you can smooth down the controls. You can use the gain and expo tuning settings, which came in a firmware a few weeks ago, and you can slow down all the movements, the angular velocity and the speed of the drone. And obviously the new tripod mode, which is available with the DJI Mini 3 Pro. So it's keeping your footage nice and smooth with no jerky movements. And that's tip number 7. Tip number 8 is updating your home point when you're on the move. So if you're tracking yourself on a bike or in a car, something like that, then it's always advisable to update your home point when you're on the move. The last thing you want it to do is to fly back to the original home point that was set when you took off. And this comes in handy as well if you're on a boat and you've took off from a harbour and you've sailed out somewhere. The last thing that you wanted it to do is to fly back to that harbour and you've set sail somewhere in the middle of the sea. So updating your home point, I did a video on this a couple of weeks back. If you're not sure how to do that, there'll be a card up there if you want to check out that video as well. Tip number 9 is flying sideways. Flying sideways with the Mini 3 Pro. There's no side sensors, as you probably know. So you have to make sure that when you're flying sideways, that you're not going to crash into something. Best thing to do is take the drone up, spin it around 360 degrees and make sure that you're not in any danger of flying into something that's on the side. That's tip number 9. Tip number 10, while we're on the subject of sensors, the Mini 3 Pro has got forward, back and downward facing sensors, as we all know, but these are not available in sports mode. I've seen people on the forums where they put it into sports mode and they've flown into a wall and it's just crashed. You see some horrific stories. It's not available in sports mode. However, a couple of weeks ago I did a video all about return to home, and when you're in sports mode, if you use return to home, the sensors will become active, but not whilst you're flying. So in the return to home, the Mini 3 Pro or any DJI drone with sports mode, it will activate those sensors on the return to home because it's going to find its way back using the smart return to home. So just be careful when using sports mode, there's no sensors active at any time. Tip number 11, same thing again, while we're using the DJI Mini 3 Pro or any DJI drone that has the obstacle avoidance, you can turn these off for when you're flying through tight spaces. But one tip is to remember is make sure you turn them back on. I know it sounds daft and it's a common mistake, but you could be flying in tight spaces and then decide to go and fly something close to trees or something like that, and you've not turned the sensors back on. So always check, and always check when you first take off that the sensors are on, either bypass or brake mode. You might be flying the day before, flying in tight spaces, doing some nice intricate shots, and then you forget that you've turned them off. So always double check in your menus that the obstacle avoidance is turned back on. Tip number 12, I think this one is, well, probably the most important, and that's flying in windy conditions. If you're flying at some distance, make sure that you take the Mini 3 Pro against the wind when you're flying out. The last thing you want to be doing is flying with the wind, and then when you're trying to get back to yourself, that's going to start to struggle in high winds. And the last thing you want to be doing is plopping into a lake if you're flying over water because you've not got enough battery power to get you back. And that's another good tip, is always check your battery levels. You can do this by tapping the battery icon, as you can see just here, and that will tell you exactly how long you've got left at what your current status is with your battery. So tip number 12, always make sure that you fly against the wind so that you've got a tailwind coming back. And a bonus tip, tip 13, lucky 13 or unlucky 13 if you want to call it that, check your storage, check your SD card storage and make sure that you've got enough storage there to capture your videos or your photos, whatever you want to take. Last thing you want to be doing is flying out, taking photos and pictures, and it comes up with the error message saying no storage available. Another handy tip, as I showed you a couple of weeks ago, is if you've got a SD card stored in the RC, you can use that as a spare. I always carry a couple of SD cards in the bag as spares, just in case we get low on the storage. Usually what I do is when I get home is I dump everything off the SD card and then I wipe the card clean for the next flight. Get into the habit, store it onto a hard drive and you won't go far wrong. So there we go, just 12 popular mistakes and tips on how to overcome these common mistakes when flying as a beginner or as an intermediate, or as I said earlier in the video, any flyer. Sometimes you have a bit of a blank when you're out flying, you think, oh, I forgot to do that. So just a few tips for you there. Hope you've enjoyed the video and found it useful and got at least one thing out of it. If you have, well, give us the old thumbs up. And if you're new around here, why don't you consider subscribing, dinging the dong and all the rest of it that goes with it. I'm sure you know me by now. And we will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.